Well, Brother Scott, thank you
You're welcome.
for preparing that meal for us. Wow. What an awesome teaching on the book of Ruth. I'm I feel full. I feel fed.
Hey, you've been fed. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I like the way you find humor in some things that most people would pass over, but
Right.
you add that. Thank you.
The humor is built in when you read it in its context.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have picked it up like he did.
That's why
Right. And
it's good to know
you have to know the culture and the
Mhm.
language. And yeah, that's sometimes you get those deeper insights. And sometimes I even read something in a commentary that I hadn't noticed myself.
And I think God created you to enable us to understand these very complicated stories.
And thank you, Crystal. So if Boaz's children through Ruth are attributed to Elimelech,
Only one, only the firstborn son.
only the firstborn son.
Right.
Okay. All right. That answers that question. So I was going to say, then legally Boaz would never have any children.
No,
So it's only the first
only
one.
son.
Okay. The firstborn son out of that union
Right.
will then be attributed to the former kinsman.
Right.
Okay.
The
Everybody
rest
else.
are mine. I get to keep them.
Okay.
Also, when our husbands die, we don't just go off and marry their brothers anymore.
Yeah. Aren't you
Yes.
glad?
Yes. Oh, yes.
I hope not.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, my second question.
Mm-hmm.
When Boaz is talking to so-and-so, which so-and-so is the other redeemer,
Right.
he says, the other redeemer says, yes, I'll buy the land. And he said, well, with the land comes Ruth.
Mm-hmm.
Why not with the land comes Naomi?
Very good. See, this is another one of those things where I say, oh, it looks like Boaz is being a stickler for the rules.
But he's not.
But the rule actually says that you take the wife of the deceased, and that would be Naomi. So
is Boaz kind of trying to skew because he wants to marry Ruth himself?
Well, actually,
it's not said in the Bible.
Yeah,
we need
it's not
anything
described.
will be.
And I think this is part of the problem with the Old Testament law that we recognize, when I talked about in my series on the law, there's so much that's unspecified.
It's
what do you do with
arbitrary.
that? It's such a burden. The Jews made up all these rules, right? I tell people, pick up a copy of the Mishnah and just glance through it.
What's the Mishnah?
The Mishnah is all the man-made rules that the Jews made to tack on to the law because the law doesn't specify. You have to take a Sabbath day and don't do any work. Well, what's work, right? I told you about this in that series. Some, writing a certain number of words is not work, but when you write the very next word, they consider that work. So I had to make up all these rules, and they don't even agree upon the rules. It's such a mass confusion that what we really should do with the law is learn the principles. It's the principle that God doesn't want the land to leave, and he wants to see widows cared for and the husband's name not to be cut off. So Boaz could have just said, I'll marry Ruth, I'll redeem the land. I don't need to check with the redeemer. The principle is the land stays with the clan, the widow is cared for. And that's why I find this maybe a character flaw with Boaz, this sticking with the rules.
It's a humanness.
Yeah. And yet, as you point out, if you really wanted to stick with the rules, why don't you marry Naomi? But Naomi, maybe she's older now. Maybe she's not of a childbearing age anymore. Maybe she's not capable of producing an heir. We don't know for certain.
Right. Okay.
Anyway, good question. I'm glad somebody spotted that. I was going to talk about it.
Aren't you glad that my hand? Okay, my third question. How do they measure the 50th year for Jubilee? Is it the same for everybody, or is it it specific to the situation of selling of land or counting
yes,
on?
it's the same for everyone.
Not like you sold your land, so 50 years from you selling that land, it becomes So
it's something that's it actually probably it begins with the Exodus, because I would
What
guess
about
then
with
when
them?
the coming of the law at Mount Sinai would be
Okay.
starting now, count 7 years. Every 7 year there's a land Sabbath. Every 7 sevens, that's 49 years. Then the next one is going to be Jubilee year.
So that whole, the land will have a Sabbath rest, takes on even more meaning, because the entire land will not have a harvest for those 2.5 years.
If they're obeying the rules.
If they're obeying the rules.
But I don't think they ever obeyed the rules.
Right.
That's the impression I get from reading the Old Testament.
Okay.
We have a question. When is the Jubilee system over? Well, it's over with the coming of Jesus Christ, with the end of the law. We are not under law, but under grace. When does the law is fulfilled in Christ at his first advent? He said, I've not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. The law and the prophets is all the Old Testament. So in Christ, in his first coming, it's all fulfilled. That includes the Mosaic law. And we are counted as if we have kept the law. So the Jubilee system is over. Now, when I was talking about symbolic numbers, there's a very interesting tie-in with Jubilee. The number 7 is a symbolic number. And every 7 days, there's a Sabbath. Every 7 days, you get the Sabbath. And every 7 years, there's a land Sabbath. And we have 7 sevens. That's the
49.
Jubilee, the great release, the freedom. It's a kind of super Sabbath, right? Super Sabbath. But then there's one more. There's the ultimate Sabbath, which we find in the book of Daniel, chapter 9, which is a prophecy of 77s until the coming of Messiah. 77s is 490 years from the time of the going out of the decree to restore and build Jerusalem. The coming of Messiah brings us to the ultimate Sabbath, the very last one. No more need for any more Sabbaths, no more need for Jubilees. And all that comes to its end, at least in terms of law keeping and keeping days, in the person of Christ, who is our Sabbath.
And we get our life redeemed back to us.
Yes, we get redeemed by God permanently, once for all, the once for all sacrifice that redeems us for all time.
As long as you accept it.
Yes. And
follow Jesus as
living it out is
right.
required.
Wow.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And the Jewish people actually knew this. Their rabbis were able to do the calculation too, and they were expecting the Messianic age to begin in the 1st century AD. But because they rejected Jesus as their Messiah, the one who God actually sent, they had to make up a new story. And so what they claimed is, we weren't worthy for Messiah to come, yet the Messianic age did begin. When did it begin? In the 1st century AD. That's when they date the Messianic age. They just claim that, well, there was no Messiah.
He hasn't shown up yet.
Yeah.
Well, maybe the one you're looking for hasn't, because he doesn't exist.
Right. That's right. That's what happens to people. They set their own expectations and hope God will meet their expectations. But God doesn't listen to us. He gives us what he has prepared. And it's up to you to either accept it or reject it. And these people reject it because they want something else that God is not going to provide to them. And that's just sad.